I will just explain that you may or may not have watched the worship service yet, but we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the ordination of women in the ELCA, which occurred in both the ALC and LCA in 1970. Those are the predecessor bodies. And as Ruth says in the worship service, it was 40 years ago the first woman of color was ordained, and 10 years ago that the LGBTQ community was authorized to be pastors in the ELCA. And we have a number of guests here today. Let me see if I can point them all out. Lynn Erickson, who was an interim, and she can only stay for part of the time. Everybody disappeared on me. Sonja Hagander, who grew up in the church. Cindy Senarighi, who grew up in the church. I can't see everybody anymore, so. Marie Olson Purcell, who grew up in the church, and Rebecca Wold Freeman, who also grew up in the congregation, and then Pastor Anita Beste, who was the first woman called, and Pastor Ruth and Cori and myself. And we have asked that Caryn be our moderator this morning. So I'll turn it over to Caryn.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this to this discussion. I grew up Missouri Synod Lutheran, which still is backwards enough to not recognize the fact that women are effective in the ministry. Someday, hopefully they will get there, but I'm delighted to be able to moderate this. And we're going to start with general question. And I think because of the just the logistics of Zoom, I'm going to go down the list, at least for this first question, and just call on people in the order in which I have the names. And the first thing I'd like is to introduce yourself. You know, what's your connection to Prince of Peace, where and when you were ordained, where you've served, and then what you're doing now. So Pastor Anita, I think I'll start with you. And you'll make sure to turn, you'll want to put yourself off of mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Caryn.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you all. And Steve sends his greetings as well. He's going to watch some of this stuff later. Anita Beste, I was ordained in 1995. Like Caryn, I also came out of the Missouri Synod tradition, which has some strengths, but also some weaknesses. And Caryn and I would frequently compare notes. My first call was to Cambridge Lutheran, about an hour north of the Twin Cities. I was there for 6 years, and then was called to Prince of Peace in 2001 and served for 15 years. I came as associate with Andrew Rogness, and then as his cancer developed, Prince of Peace saw fit to call us as co-pastors. And then when he died, I was called as senior pastor. So that was a growth experience for me, and maybe a growth experience for Prince of Peace too, but I'm very grateful for that. I retired in 2016 when Steve and I went out east where some of our 2/3 of our kids were, and he had a sabbatical year. And then I came back and did 2 interims, about a year each, both up in the Lino Lake Circle Pines area. And I finished June 15th. So I started doing the recorded worship, and my heart goes out to all the pastors who are still doing that. So I'm fully retired now.
Thanks, Anita. Pastor Lynn, why don't we take you next, because I know you've got some time constraints.
Hi, everybody. It's just such a joy to see all of you. I served at Prince of Peace as an interim pastor during kind of a whirlwind time in my life. After my husband Paul was elected bishop in Milwaukee, I stayed in the Twin Cities while our daughter was graduating from high school. I was serving a church in West St. Paul, and then came to Prince of Peace, which was really a highlight for me of that kind of weird time in my life to come alongside all of you as had kind of a fancy title. I'm not sure I'm going to get that quite right. The pastoral visitation, congregational care. I got to visit people, and that was awesome. I am currently serving at Ascension in Milwaukee, which is a 3-language congregation, English, Spanish, and Hmong. And just very recently, our Hmong pastor bought a house in California and left. So I've come up against a clear limit that I can't speak Hmong. So, but that's what I'm doing later this morning. I am on the Hmong service today. So I'm grateful for all of you for the just tremendous work that you do there at Prince of Peace. Such great leaders. Was really a highlight of my professional life.
Yeah. Thanks, Lynn. Pastor Sonja.
Good morning, everybody. It's really fun to see all your faces and be with you. Thanks for the invitation. I grew up at Prince of Peace and was raised up by many of you. My ordination date was June 1995, and I was ordained at Prince of Peace, and Paul Sponheim preached on John on the theme of friendship. And my first call was Our Savior's Lutheran Church in East Bethel, just south of where Anita first served, and we overlapped actually. And then in 1998, I was called to Augsburg College, at that point, now it's Augsburg University, as associate pastor. And Dave Wold, Becca's dad, was my boss and a great colleague, and we served together for a million years. After he retired, I was called there as university pastor, and then most recently finished up my time there as vice president for mission and identity. And now I'm an interim senior pastor at St. Anthony Park Lutheran Church, starting July 1. So my whole time there thus far has been virtual, which is really wild. But I'm enjoying my time as an interim and getting to ask some big questions and unpack some systems alongside just all the regular stuff that pastors do. So good to be with you all.
Thanks, Sonja. Pastor Becca, that looks like a good lead into you.
Hi. Yeah, Sonja, so good to see you. And all of you, but fun that I can go right after Sonja. I am Becca Wold Freeman, and I was ordained in 2007. I grew up at Prince of Peace, and as I was just saying on our little breakout Zoom, I grew up at Prince of Peace from 1980 until I graduated from college, and then I moved out to Seattle. And so then when I came back for seminary, I became affiliated with Gloria Dei through my Con Ed, and that is where I was ordained in 2007. I'm on my 4th church now. So I served 2 churches in Sioux Falls, and Betsy Hoium and I were both associate pastors in Sioux Falls at different churches. My first church was St. John American Lutheran Church in Sioux Falls that I served for 3 years. And then Spirit of Joy Lutheran Church in Sioux Falls after that for another 3 to 4 years. And then I went to Bethel Lutheran Church in Northfield and was there for about 5 years. And now I am at Mount Olivet Lutheran Church in Minneapolis and Victoria. And I've been there for just over a year. So good to be with you. And yes, it was as you'll hear, one of my role models in ministry is Sonja, because she is the first woman I ever saw do this kind of work. And then she worked with my dad all those years, which is super fun. So good to be with you.
Thanks, Becca. Pastor Cindy.
Oh boy. I think I'm most well known as Jim and Joan Gepford's daughter. And we'll just start there because I think everybody here kind of might know them, since they're kind of like the pillars of the church, going back to Alexander Ramsey, where the church was started and where I was attending. I am, and we'll talk about this later, I'm a second career pastor, so I wasn't ordained till 2008. And that was after being a parish nurse and then taking the long road to ordination and, you know, whole other story. And I was ordained at St. Andrew's in Matamidi. And that's where I had done my Con Ed, where I'd worked as a chaplain. at St. Andrew's Village. And wow, I retired in 2018. I left St. Andrews in 2015. My role there was interesting. I was congregational care at 34 hours a week and chaplain to St. Andrew's Village at 16 hours a week. And that's a whole other conversation. But I enjoyed the people so much that I just, jumped in and just loved my time there. So I don't want to paint the hours as being an issue, but it was a different call, kind of like listening to all of you and your different calls. I mean, it's like, there's titles and then there's the people, and you just take care of the people. So, boy, is that it? Did I answer all the questions?
Yeah, and now you are.
Oh, yes, that too. And if you saw the gospel reading, you were invited into my current call, which is what I've been doing for over 20 years now, is yoga devotion, where I integrate faith and yoga and show the intersections between the two. And I think that will always be my call. That'll be the call until the day I die. I think it's an important call, especially like to talk about it now, because we are talking about the incarnation these days. And, as God came to us in the body, I feel like yoga devotion is a call that takes us to God with our bodies. So, and that'll be the public service announcement from me.
It was fun seeing you do the reading in your yoga pants.
Thank you. Pretty much what I live in these days.
It was awesome. Great, Pastor Marie.
Hello, good morning. So yeah, I'm Marie Olson Purcell. So as Cindy mentioned, I'm most well known for being the daughter of Kent and Linda Olson at Prince of Peace. So yeah, we joined the church. Mom and Dad, I actually can't quite remember the year, but I was in 8th grade. So I was starting confirmation. And during my time in confirmation, we had a transition in pastors. And so Anita, I think you came just right after I was confirmed, but grew up. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then, all through my formative high school years, I had Anita as a role model and pastor at Prince of Peace. And then I went to St. Olaf and came back and went to Luther. I actually finished my Con Ed at Prince of Peace. I had also done it at Grace University Lutheran. But finished it at Prince of Peace, and then got to serve as a interim youth director at Prince of Peace, just for a short while, and was ordained there. And then my first call, and my only call thus far, I was associate pastor in San Antonio, Texas. And this will come up later too, but one unique thing about that is that my senior pastor was also a woman. So we were a 2-women ministry team, which is still relatively unheard of. And we were a very young ministry team, because when I started, she was under 40. We were both under 40. So that was pretty remarkable and wonderful to serve with her. That was Leslie Price. And after that, I've always kind of felt a call to do PhD studies. So I am now in Dallas, Texas, and doing my PhD studies in religious studies, religion and culture at Southern Methodist University. So that is where I am right now, on leave from call for study.
Thanks, Marie. So going with the youth director aspect, seminary student Cori.
Yeah, most of you know me as Cori, the youth director. Coincidentally, I'm also Cori, the seminary student. So I am in my, what year? Wow, let's think here.
Third.
Yes, thank you. I was like second, and I'm like, no, it's just time has strangely stopped in this whole pandemic situation. So it's very weird. So yes, I'm in my 3rd year, working towards a culminating internship, which just means that I will finish all of my studies first and then leave and do internship before ordination. And, as pandemic has it, it's, pushing out my ordination date, which has yet to be determined, but graduation keeps getting pushed out from doing fewer classes because we're all online. So who knows how long you'll be stuck with me, Prince of Peace. I grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up ELCA in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. Anything else you want to know right now, Caryn?
That sounds good. Thanks, Cori. Pastor Betsy.
Hi. As you know, I came to Prince of Peace in 2018. I grew up at First Lutheran in Columbia Heights, and they did a service similar to this in October about recognizing the ordination of women, which was kind of fun to be part of. And this is my third call. My first call was at Peace Lutheran in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and that's where I got to know Becca, and Marie's brother Eric was also serving in South Dakota at the time. And then I was at Living Waters in Lino Lakes for a short time, and now here at Prince of Peace. And as I said in the sermon, I've always had women pastors since I was in 7th grade as role models, which was really fun. I did my internship at Redeemer in White Bear, and Pam Stoffren, who was my internship supervisor, it was really fun. She hadn't been in ministry too long, so we were kind of learning and figuring things out together. And we're a 2-woman team, like Marie was mentioning, which was fun and quite unusual.
Okay. Thanks, Pastor Betsy. And Pastor Ruth.
So I was ordained in 2006, and my first call was to St. Timothy Lutheran Church, just south of us, and Becca Wold. So I'm the 3rd longest serving pastor at St. Timothy, but her grandfather, Orv Wold, was the absolute longest serving. So when I came to St. Timothy in 2006, the Orv stories were amazing. So I got to know Orv a little bit at Lynn Gloomston. And then Dave also served in that associate role. So I was there until 2018, and then I came to Prince of Peace to be as Lynn said, it was a long title. It's Visitation and Congregational Care Pastor. So doing that part-time, and then also the other part of my time is spent as a spiritual director with my own practice. So and I was ordained at Roseville Lutheran. That's where I grew up. And Roseville Lutheran actually produced a lot of women pastors, but didn't have a female pastor until pretty recently. So it was interesting how many of us came out of Roseville before one came into Roseville. So, and they were, until recently, had one of the senior and associate female partnerships as well. That's it.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for those wonderful backgrounds. The next question that I'm going to go, and I think once again, I'm just going to go down the list as well because of Zoom facilitation. So this question is, before going into ordained ministry, did you have women pastors as role models, or who was the first woman that you heard preach? So a little bit about, kind of the beginning. Did you have women pastors as role models, or who was the first woman that you heard preach? So once again, Pastor Anita.
I went to Valparaiso University from 1972 to 1976, and that is a Missouri Synod college. And I got a religion degree with no thought of ever becoming a pastor. Now, why would I get a religion degree in 1976? And I am embarrassed. I didn't even ask the question, why can't I be a pastor? I just loved learning about spiritual things. And so I find that interesting. And then Steve did his graduate work in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is 8 miles down the road from Duke University. And for a while we worshiped at Duke University. And the first woman pastor I heard was the campus pastor, one of the campus pastors at Duke. I think her first name was Charlotte or Charlene. And I remember thinking, fancy that. And so then it went on from there. But that would probably have been, we moved in 1977, so maybe 1978. So let's say 8 years after the ELCA or the bodies are ordaining, I still had not even heard of a woman pastor. until this Methodist college campus.
Thanks, Anita. Pastor Lynn.
I grew up in a very small town, in a well, actually our rural church was fairly large. It drew from a large area. One of the things I loved about church is it made my world so much bigger. And I think probably the first women in ministry I knew were missionaries in other parts of the world that I had never even heard of. But I was thinking about this question because I thought, where was it I first encountered a woman pastor? And it was probably at camp. When I was serving as a camp counselor in college, I worked with lots of pastors who came through the camp with their confirmation classes. So it was there as a camp counselor and later as a camp director where I was really struck by just the variety of people that get called into ministry. God calls all kinds of people, and some of them you wouldn't believe could be used for ministry, but it's true. And that's probably where I first heard women preach, was around a campfire in outdoor ministry as a young adult, in serving as a camp counselor and then later as a camp director.
Great.
And
go ahead.
the good thing on the farm is that I grew up in a very small rural area of Iowa, but my parents, there was nothing I couldn't be. So I never thought that wasn't available to me. I never felt not called to some kind of ministry, even as a child.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Pastor Sonja.
Yeah, this is actually a hard question. I was trying to recall, did I have women pastors as role models? And I think my first answer is no. I don't recall anyone growing up. I recall really strong lay leaders of all genders at Prince of Peace. And I think the community was my model in many ways. And the way in which we were raised up at Prince of Peace, I think was all of our callings were important and part of being named as beloved in God. And so there was this, I always felt a sense of freedom, right? To share our gifts, that we all had something in this web as part of the body of Christ. So that was really a strong sense growing up, but I don't recall any single one woman pastor as a role model. Later, I think I heard my grandfather, who was a pastor for many, many years, talk about lady pastors. And at first, he sort of wondered who these lady pastors were showing up in North Dakota. And then he became the #1 advocate and fan, just a beautiful, powerful force. But I think the first woman I heard preach was at Trinity Lutheran Church in Moorhead, maybe in high school, as we would go there as a family. And I should recall her name. It's bad that I can't, right? It's important to name. And I was going to take time to look up the name. But she preached on food for the idols, that text in the New Testament. And I will never forget, she used the example of wearing open-toed shoes while she led worship, and that was offensive. And somehow she worked, because of the narrative of that text, we care for the congregation, so she would then wear closed-toed shoes because of the way that would have less offense to the people of God. I'll never forget that.
Wow.
Wow, fascinating. Becca.
Yeah, that's a great story, Sonja. Wow. And I'm sure you have many stories kind of like it for ministry. Anyway, as I mentioned before, Sonja was really the first woman I ever saw do anything in ministry. And I can remember, forgive me, anything formally like an ordained ministry, because I agree with exactly what Sonja said. Tons of lay leaders uplifted us and modeled what it means to live up in lives of faith. But Sonja was the one who was my ordained ministry, the first woman I've seen preach in ordained ministry. And I still remember a sermon you must have preached maybe when you were at seminary or what, I don't know. But I remember the example in your intro had something to do with coloring crayons. And it was the first time I'd heard a woman preach. And so I don't even remember what it was, but I do remember that example in one of your intros of your sermon. So that was that. And to piggyback on what Sonja just said about the lay leaders, I remember doing a paper on women in ministry at seminary. And because it's been mentioned a few times here, so my dad was a pastor, but both of my grandpas were pastors too, and great grandfathers were pastors. And so I uplifted my mom and my two grandmas as my role models in ministry, because they knew what it was like to be the other side of the public eye, perhaps even though they were very much in the public eye as well, and what that modeled to me for what it could be as a woman in ministry. And so I give great thanks for what they lived and continue to live.
It's fascinating. Great. Thank you. Pastor Cindy.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes.
That was a great lead in, Rebecca, because I feel the same way. And you're all going to be a little surprised at who I picked as the first woman that I believe preached to me. And she wasn't ordained. And she was just the beginning of a long line of women that were servant leaders who also could speak, could also preach. And that's Emmy Bragstead. So some of you might remember Bob. He was my pastor growing up, and I hung out with Jeannie. We were the secret mission agents of Prince of Peace for many years. And I was over there for dinner one time, which I was always invited to their home. And Bob was talking about a sermon he was going to preach. And quietly, Emmy started to preach right at the dinner table. She was like quietly leading him into some conversation, and she was preaching. I just remember it being preaching. It had all the elements of preaching. And sure enough, the next Sunday, it's almost like the sermon that she preached to him at the dinner table was the sermon that he preached to the congregation. And I think that's when I think about those things, I kind of think about the fact that or official or unofficial, ordained or unordained, or lay leadership, we all kind of come together in this world to preach. But as far as awareness of women pastors, every single one of you that's here today has affected my call. But I think my eyes were opened when I went to seminary, who I can thank Lauren Reitzman for, because she's the one that told me that I had a lot of great ideas and I would not get to speak them unless I got the collar, which is a very interesting call story. But I mean, then I went to seminary, and there's like Sarah Heinrich and Janet Ramsey, and of course, Caroline Lewis. And then, and then all of you that are here today, I've interacted with. So I can't pin it to one person, because I grew up in the 50s and women just weren't legitimate ordained pastors for the most part at that time. We were just coming up to speed. But I would echo Rebecca in saying that, then there's my mom, and then there's some of you here who grew me up in the church and preached to me in different ways. And so I'm gonna leave it right there. Emmy Bragstead was the start of the whole thing. So.
Wow, that's a great story. Yeah, Pastor Marie.
Yeah, well, I think I am pretty lucky. I'm a younger woman pastor, and therefore I already had a lot of role models, and I feel like there was already, I think it's partially just credit to my home and how I grew up, but Anita was the first was a woman, instead of saying lady pastor, woman pastor, pastor who happened to be a woman, that I had regularly. And I really appreciate all the wisdom and guidance and everything I learned from you, Anita. But I think one thing I'm so glad about is that, and maybe it was just naivete, I was still young when you came as pastor, but I never like second guessed that. It wasn't like, oh, how strange. And I think that was partially from, I don't think you were the first woman I had seen preach. And I can't remember, like Sonja was saying, I don't remember where I first saw a woman preach. And I think that's a blessing, that it was enough of my upbringing that I don't have a poignant moment of like, oh my gosh, a woman is preaching. And I do know, my mom was a church secretary in Ames, Iowa. And I think from what I hear, she was more like the church administrator. But she was there and had so many interns come and go. And one of the interns was April Larson, who went on to become the first woman bishop in the ELCA. And her niece was one of my best friends growing up. And so like, I don't know that I saw April preach, but it was always just like this culture of women are in ministry and they can be, and I never had to second guess that. And so I think that's a blessing. And one thing I did want to, I also wanted to mention Jennifer Koenig and Elizabeth Palmer. They were pastor at St. Olaf when I was there, and an intern pastor at St. Olaf, who I think also were really helpful in continuing that image and that this is something I can do. But the mention about open-toed shoes and Caroline Lewis, I remember in seminary, Caroline Lewis told us, people will notice if you're wearing open-toed shoes or not. And I was about ready to go on internship in Las Vegas, where it's really hot. And so I went up to her like really nervous. I was like, can I not wear sandals? She's like, it's not that you can't, but you have to know that they will notice if you're wearing what types of shoes, and it will be commented on. And surely it has. The type of shoes I've been wearing has been commented on at different times. So for good or ill.
Wow. Thanks. Cori.
Yeah, it was really interesting to think about this question. And I think that I'm in a similar position as Marie, that just simply because of when I was born and the era that I've grown up in, I haven't ever questioned it, which is interesting because when I looked back on it, the church that I grew up in still has never had a female pastor. And I would bet that they will not for decades. And I was completely ignorant to the patriarch in that church until many years after I had been gone from it into college. And my parents had chosen to leave that church, and that church had chosen to leave the ELCA. But so I grew up with male pastors. I think the first time that I realized, I don't think I ever questioned that women could be pastors, but when we called the pastor who confirmed me, him and his wife were both ordained. She was taking a leave from call as she was having her second child of 4. And so she wasn't in a call, but occasionally if Mike couldn't preach for whatever reason, she would do it. And so she's very likely the first woman that I heard preach, but it doesn't stick out to me, in the same way that Marie was saying, like, it just wasn't like a huge moment of, oh my gosh, it's a woman preaching. And I also have quite a bit of experience in outdoor ministry, like Lynn, where there were pastors from all over the place, both men and women. And so I definitely saw women pastors there, and recognized that one of the most prominent women in ministry that shaped me was our program director at Luther Park. That was Mary Tofar, for any of you guys who know the name Mary Tofar. And she has 4 or 5 children, and one of them is a pastor, one of them is a youth director, and that legacy of the amazing ministry that they did lives on, but it lives on even more so through all of the staff that went through Luther Park. I realized as I recognized my call and started at seminary that our group of leadership, my last summer at camp, there were like 5 or 6 of us. Every single one of the other ones were already ordained. And, you know, so it was just this huge recognition of the growth that we had in ministry and the leaders that we had before us, in especially in Mary Tofar. Yeah.
Thanks, Cori. Pastor Betsy.
When I was real young growing up, I remember we had beloved pastors, but they were old guys with white hair. And I think subconsciously, I learned that you had to be old, a guy, and have white hair, which I don't have. And so it was when I was in 7th grade, Carol Mork was called as the first woman pastor there. And I can't quote the sermon I heard for the first time like Sonja did, but I very distinctly remember having a woman in a role like that. And then later I was a member at Bethlehem in South Minneapolis, which is where my ordination was. And we had 2 and then 3 women pastors there. And I think subconsciously that was a big part of my call, because I could suddenly see myself doing this where I had never fathomed that idea before.
Thanks, Betsy. And Pastor Ruth.
I remember growing up in the church and seeing, you know, fabulous male pastors. And I distinctly remember asking my parents, it's like 4th or 5th grade, can women do that too? And of course, the answer was yes. So it was always a given that women could do this. I just didn't happen to see any of them until I was in seminary. So I don't remember who it was, but I know the very first time I saw a woman preach, it was literally at seminary. But those, I don't have pastors in my family, but strong people, leaders in my congregation growing up. One of those people that some of you may know is Bev Johnson at Roseville Lutheran, with all of the growing up with drama stuff and at church. Bev was pretty formative to that. My internship was at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in St. Paul, and that we met as a urban strategy of urban St. Paul churches weekly. And so I was really fortunate in my internship. My supervisor was male, but to have some amazing female colleagues. So Anita Hill at St. Paul Ref, Joy Johnson, who's a member here at Prince of Peace now, Susan Peterson, Carol Tomer. So those interactions with really fantastic leaders during internship was really helpful.
Thanks, Pastor Ruth. So playing off of the open-toed shoe stories and Pastor Ruth's devotion this morning, a couple of years ago, both the ELCA and the Methodist Church put out videos that had male pastors reading actual things that people had said to female pastors. Some of them were funny, some of them were appalling, some of them would have gotten somebody fired from a company. So the next question is, what challenges have you encountered being a woman in ministry? Have people ever said things to you that felt inappropriate or said you couldn't do something because of your gender? This should be a fun one. Pastor Anita, go. Oh, you're on mute still.
And I just want to back up a little bit. It's not exactly about the open-toed shoes, but my first sermon at Cambridge Lutheran had a dust mop in it as my intro. And it's because we had just moved and I couldn't find the dust mop. And then the movers from the church picked up my couch and my dust mop was under the couch with all the dust. So somehow I worked that in, and a few people said, wow, I've never heard a sermon with a dust mop before. My Cambridge Lutheran is a big congregation, like 2,000 members. So the vote to call me, and I was the first woman pastor at Cambridge Lutheran. They now have another one. The vote, I think the vote was like 112 yeses and 42 noes, which is unusual for calling in general. So part of that was the gender. There was also some politics, surprise, surprise. The senior pastor, and there was a beloved associate pastor that I was replacing. And so some of it was, we don't like change, but some of it was, we don't want a woman. And the story that I was told was that somebody stood up at the congregational vote meeting and said, I'd like you to read from 2 Timothy 2:11. And so in 1 Timothy, it says, a woman shall remain silent and not have authority or teaching over anybody. But they read from 2 Timothy, and it was this lovely, with God, with Jesus, we rise again. And so they read the wrong one, and the president of the congregation said, okay, here. And the person had to sit down. So somebody tried to say, we shouldn't call a woman. Now, all that being said, I got there and there were challenges. And sometimes when I left a church, men would come up to me and say, I wasn't sure about you at first, but I like you now. I mean, I've probably had 100 men say that to me. But in terms of overt hostility or problems, I don't have any horror stories, which I'm lucky because I know they're out there. But I also had good senior pastors to work with and good congregations.
Thanks, Anita. Pastor Lynn.
I think I don't like being called sweetie or honey by men in churches or women. That happens sometimes still. I have some stories. I think Marilyn Breckenridge, who was not able to join us today, preceded me at my first call at Salem in West St. Paul. And she did such an excellent job there. I don't think they would have considered calling a senior pastor as a woman without Marilyn's leadership before me. So I'm grateful, for all the women who have come before me and have put up with a lot of crap from a lot of people. I think church work is hard, and it's hard. It's not always hard because I'm a woman, but it does complicate some things. I also found, even there at Prince of Peace, that there were things I could do as a woman that Pastor Peter could never do. He could never paint Rose's fingernails, as she was dying, or comb her hair. Some things that became part of just caring for people, coming alongside people. I think there are gifts to being women in ministry. And I think you could so easily turn that around to say, oh, I can't believe I couldn't imagine having a man as a pastor. So I think I'm grateful for the places and the I've served and for the leaders there, but also for the women who have come before me.
Wow, thanks. That's powerful. I'm choked up here. Thanks, Lynn. Pastor Sonja.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Lynn. Thank you. It makes me think my kids really, their pastors have been all women growing up. And that's a stunning difference from my experience, and I'm grateful for it. When I read this question, my first thought was the book called She that Caroline Lewis wrote, who's a dear friend and a seminary classmate. And she writes in that book, I'm so thankful for dear friends, Sonja Hagander, Elizabeth Johnson, Carrie Anderson, Sarah Breckenridge Shorts, Lisa Soderlin, and Caroline Satry, who have been my support group for what it means to be a woman in ministry. We've been talking about these issues for years, since our seminary days, usually over lunch and a lot of wine, and now they're finally in print. So part of me sort of thinks, well, let's grab a cup of coffee in a small corner and talk about this. So that's part of my answer. The other part is just, I look back and I was a brand new pastor, and it was the 25th anniversary of the ordination of women. And I was filled with energy and excitement in my first call. And there were 2 celebrations going on downtown at Nicollet Mall. Some of you probably were there. One was the official celebration of the 25 years with the women that led the way. I mean, it was a stunning, amazing, incredible event. And across the street at another large hotel was an anti-event, actually led by some of my seminary professors and mentors and some women clergy who I didn't know. And I remember thinking, wow, what is going on here? And so I went to both events. I'd go back and forth literally across the street to see what this was all about. And I think largely the one that was the anti-event was based on a bad assumption about why are women and their bodies sort of more important than the gospel, rather than how the gospel comes in all of our embodied messages. And I'll never forget that. It's such a strange experience to have these opposing events. And thank goodness that life has changed. But I think, like Lynn, some of those, has anything ever been said to you, or, some of those challenges, they're really hard to discern because I find myself asking, is it me? Is it because I live in this female body, or is it just a human experience? And I think part of ministry is just letting some of that go and then trying to find the wisdom in a community to find out what's important to address. And I'm still learning that, frankly. And thank goodness there's a community of learning for that kind of work. But I think also there's, in this discernment piece about being a woman in ministry, my family's of utmost importance. And, it's a household deal. Jonathan and the kids, and my mom lives with us, as you know. That's a whole piece of it that is so vital to a lot of these questions. And I want to name that. I think I wouldn't be traversing this kind of call without their deep partnership.
Thanks, Sonja. Becca, how about you?
Everybody's so articulate. I would say I spent a life of feeling like I could do anything as well. I was raised with parents that just believed in me and gave me opportunities. And I was heavily involved in sports throughout my life. And being a woman athlete wasn't a big deal, even though I know it has been for people in the past, but I never had resistance to being a woman in what I was doing like I did when I came to the church. And so that was really surprising. It made me leave my call for a little while, my first call. As much as I loved my first call, I daily received feedback saying, we were going to leave the church because we heard a woman was coming. We aren't so sure. So yes, I was their first woman. We're not so sure. Like Anita said, we weren't so sure about you, but you've changed our minds. That's really nice. But it was also really, really hard to hear on a daily basis and have people send their dogs after me when I would come for visits and stuff. And I just would go home in tears. And but they didn't know it because I did feel called. But again, like Sonja said, my family was of utmost importance. And then I had a baby 3 years in, and I was like, I want my kid to have a good existence. And I was not fully healthy in that call. And so I left for a while, and then I was able to, take a part-time call and be a mom and a pastor at the same time. And my experience was completely different. And the thing is, I don't want to say too much bad stuff about my first church because we loved them so very much and they loved us. It was just two completely different experiences of life that kind of that came together. And so, as Sonja said, it's an experience of being human. And so like we learned about them, they learned about us, and we became really, really, really close and celebrated life together. But I just couldn't be their pastor anymore. And anyway, so yes, being a female has been hard. I've also had some blatant things happen to me, like an internship, a guy came in and gave me some Playboy magazines and stuff like that, that I think was like, you'd be fired for that, right? And I didn't know how to respond. And so I just laughed it off. And so it's things like that I don't know. It's a growing experience. You continue to learn how to become a woman in ministry and be okay in your own skin. But it's been the hardest journey of my life, I would say. But I've learned and grown a lot.
Thanks, Becca. Cindy.
All right. So I think that the big shocker for me in coming to the church as a woman, there were other women, not as senior leads in my experience, but they were associate pastors. But I've always felt like the medical field has been like 50 years to 100 years ahead of the church. And that was my experience coming into the church. I was a registered nurse, I still am. And it didn't matter in the hospital who you were. It didn't matter if you were male or female. What mattered was somebody needed your help and we're all going to do this together. And so the role typing when I was a nurse was different. And I didn't train that way. I mean, I trained as a nurse where I had to hand the doctor the chart like this, and I had to have, all this other stuff. And so when I came into the church, I came into it with that mindset, really thinking that we were all going to do this thing together to help people that, or to the mission, whatever our church mission was at the time. So I was pretty surprised when I was told to get rid of my stilettos, because I did wear high heels and I was known as Pastor Stiletto for a few years, and to get rubber soled shoes because they didn't like the clicking on the wood floors at my church, which I will honestly tell you, I was on FM 107.1 telling this story once, and I didn't get any more requests to get rid of my heels, and my colleagues that I had supported me. So all of that whole role gender thing I didn't expect it. So that was kind of a shocker to me. But the one story I will always remember is I had just gotten through preaching, and I will tell you, Marilyn Breckenridge was in the congregation that day. Had I known that, I'm pretty sure I would have been shaking in my boots, but I didn't see her because you don't really I look at big picture. And she had just come out and thanked me for my sermon and was very complimentary. And then as I'm shaking hands with people, this gentleman leaned into my ear and he said, "That was a good sermon, but you've got great legs." And I was like, this is a contemporary service, so I wasn't wearing my whole outfit. I didn't even know what to say. I couldn't say anything. I didn't say, "Well, thank you," or, whatever. And he did the whole honey thing. And I hate that too. I hate that on many levels. And so I was walking away after shaking hands. And then this other gentleman came up to me and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get hit twice in one service. It kind of took the glow off of preaching that you have when you connect with people. And he said, "We're here visiting our family and we're from the Missouri Synod tradition. And all I can say is our church is not benefiting because we have not ordained women. And we need more women in our church that preach like you did." So it was kind of like you got hit like 3 ways right away, I mean, it was like, so, I kind of see those things as little aha spirit movements. But the truth is you do remember that and you are on your guard. And, I'm old. I was an old pastor. So I thought we were past all that flirty stuff, and so that is just, it is what it is. And I'm quoting Michelle Obama there, by the way. And I just don't know what to do about it. I think it's going to change. I don't know if it'll change to the degree I'd like to see it change. I think we are changing in the church. But you know, I come from a long line of huggers, if you know my dad. And so some of those things that we naturally do as women, we have to step back from, and we also have to help people forward to think about how we approach ourselves and others in our bodies, our human bodies. And I think that's probably part of why I'm so intentional about the call I'm in right now, which isn't official, by the way. I just want you to know that I think it's my call. So there you go.
Thanks, Cindy. Marie, how about you?
Yeah. Well, actually, the thing that just popped in my head right here is that the theme for today was peace in the struggles. And so, because the thing that I was thinking about is just how sometimes sexism can be so subtle. And sometimes you do, I think Sonja was the one who mentioned, like, you have to really discern, like, is this a human thing? What is this? And Becca, you mentioned like laughing it off. Like, how do you respond? And sometimes, I mean, having someone hand you Playboy magazines is pretty overt, but like sometimes there's things that are just really subtle, and you realize, reflecting later, you're like, that was a little off. That was, and I don't know if I just perpetuated that in the moment. But then peace in the struggle, sometimes you need to just be like, you know, is this a fight worth having, or do I just laugh this off for the social engagement that it is and move on? So by and large, I feel that I have been really lucky that I haven't had overt things very often. And I start with all of that to say, I think sometimes if I were to pause and think back, I would think about more times when I maybe came up against subtle sexism. But like some of the more overt things were, I also once on internship, it was a contemporary service. Or, I think usually we wore our robes, our albs, and we hadn't that Sunday. And I'd wore a knee-length skirt with maybe 1.5 inch heel. And I got a letter afterwards addressed to my senior pastor, where a man had talked about being distracted by my calves. And so, you know, we had to then, we crafted some reply about, look, well, we hear that you appreciate the albs, but it has also highlighted for me the safety of wearing an alb as a woman, and that it not only reminds people of your status as clergy with the stole, but it also hides your body in a way. I've also, though, been extremely pregnant in an alb, which is another way of having your body as a woman out there, right? But I have a very sweet story too. Someone mentioned being called a lady pastor, and there was this really sweet man in my congregation in San Antonio, and I don't recall ever hearing him call me lady pastor or anything like that. And it might have been one of those things where maybe he did, but I didn't actually hear it because it's that subtle, such a subtle thing. But he wrote a letter to me and my senior pastor apologizing profusely that he just had this moment, this aha moment of realizing he'd been calling us lady pastors, and he wanted to ask our forgiveness for that. And it was just this moment of really sweetness that we hadn't been offended by him, but he took it upon himself to reach out to us, and that was really sweet. I don't want to talk too long, but one thing I do want to mention is that I was on a team of 2 women pastors, and my senior pastor, she was the first pastor at that congregation. And there was a long time at the beginning where, especially when they decided to call me as the second woman, there was kind of a expectation that we have regular pulpit guests that were male. So there would still be a male voice from the pulpit. Now, I wonder how many male teams have had that expectation placed upon them to have a regular female. We also were all very conscious of, because we were 2 women pastors, and this was a congregation that where all of the worship assistants would sit up front, and it was very obvious who all the worship assistants were. Oftentimes we would have a lot of female worship assistants. And so we'd realize, oh my gosh, we're having all women in the front. Now, on the one hand, you might be like, oh, you know, that's awesome, break the glass ceiling. but it was something we also tried to be really conscious of, and whether or not sometimes that was something like, hey, it's all women, or, you know, we're thinking of RBG talking about when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court when there are 9. So that's not to say it's a matter of taking over, but there is something to be said for, oh, you know, this just happened that we had all women, but we shouldn't be just like we shouldn't be colorblind. I don't think we should be gender blind. And so I think in that instance, we did try to, with intentionality, think about finding male, have some variety in our worship attendance. And I think that that is admirable to do. And I would hope that if there are congregations where there's all men ministry teams, that they would have that kind of intentionality as well. And that would truly be paying attention as well.
Great, thanks, Marie. Pastor Betsy, let's jump to you. Cori had to go, she's jumping over to talk to the youth.
Yes, I was ordained 8 years ago and was surprised that shortly after I got to my first call, and I was the 5th woman they had called in the role I was in, that it was a service where we were not wearing albs and I had a knee-length skirt on, and somebody came out to shake hands and said, "I'm so glad we have a pastor who can wear short skirts." And I said, "Is it too short?" And, you know, got all flustered. He said, "Oh, no, I was trying to say that you looked nice." It was like, whoa. And I also belong to one of the health clubs in Sioux Falls, and it's kind of a big, small town. And so I would run into people from church, and I was at the pool one day, and a member of the congregation who was a big man said to me, "You look really good in that suit." I was like, should I quit coming here? Oh my gosh, I was dumbfounded. I had no idea. And then I talked to one of my colleagues, a man, and he's like, "Oh, that's just so-and-so." I'm like, And we do an internship in hospital chaplaincy. And one day I went in to visit a patient. I think it was somebody who'd been there for a while. They hadn't asked to see a chaplain. And he threw me out of the room saying, "You can't be a chaplain. Women can't go into ministry," and stuff like that. And it said Lutheran on his record, but he was Missouri or Wisconsin Synod. And so that was like stunning me, like being thrown out because I'm a woman that blatantly. I did realize that all of us who were working that day, we had men also, but it was all women who were working that day. So it just happened that I drew that patient, and he would have said the same thing to any of the women, but it was really hard to hear. And I'm a second career pastor. I'd previously been working at the Airports Commission, and you couldn't say any of those things in another kind of work setting.
Thanks, Pastor Betsy. Pastor Ruth.
Yeah, the inappropriate, So I have run the gamut between the microaggressions and the macro. One of the horror stories, but the microaggressions to me are interesting. I was visiting a woman, old East Sider. I was pretty new in ministry, and she leaned over and she touched my knee and she said, "You are the cutest little girl pastor I have ever met." And I thought I should make myself a name tag. I am the cutest little girl pastor. So those things, you know, hair, shoes, clothes, all of that have happened over and over. It becomes very routine. And as I mentor seminary students too, I always encourage people to think about, what is your phrase that you're going to have in your back pocket? I used to be called Mrs. Pastor at a previous call, and I would say, "I prefer Pastor Ruth, thank you." And every time, you know, you just have to have these stock kind of responses. I have been physically threatened. I wrote in my devotion today about one experience of a picketer. That was not that experience. But I have, because of my gender and my position, we can't be naive that there are people who are angered or intimidated by strong women in ministry. Like, that's just a reality. And so there are women who have had to work with law enforcement and do things that you would never imagine that you would be doing in ministry. also to know that as the Me Too movement came out, there's a Me Too movement in church leaders as well. Lots of women have experienced sexual harassment. Again, micro and macro levels. So just know that that is a reality even now for lots of women in ministry. I'm so heartened by the numbers of women going into ministry. I think it's more than 50% at seminary, I think, right now. And so one of you said earlier, I don't know when this will get better. It will get better. Part of it is just training, not women leaders, but congregations about what's appropriate and what is not appropriate.
Great. Thanks, Pastor Ruth. Wanted to quickly acknowledge the time. We could probably have a 5-hour panel, I think. I'm actually going to ask Marie a question about her research and then ask for any of the panelists that have any final thoughts they want to share. But Marie, I know your PhD research, women are a focus of your PhD. So if you want to just touch on that a little bit, and then any of the other panelists that want to follow on with parting thoughts. This has been fascinating.
Sure, yes, I can talk briefly about my research, and it has been really an honor to be with all of you pastors. And so my research is really about, I do ethnographic work now and interviewing women, and I've been doing participant observation at First Baptist Dallas, which is a very conservative theologically and political church. And so my dissertation is really about trying to seek understanding across difference. And what's really interesting about this morning is I'm having huge cultural whiplash because the church that I'm studying is from the Southern Baptist Convention, which does not ordain women. And so it has been a very interesting, eye-opening experience to have grown up the way I did, like I said, where I never questioned myself in ministry, and now be studying and immersed in a culture where that is absolutely not allowed. And so in that setting, I've been asked, when I try to be open about the fact that I'm ordained, I've been asked like, oh, but were you a pastor to just women or women and men? Well, women and men. Oh, so did you, we were studying First Corinthians 11, I think, that morning in the Sunday school class, like, oh, so do you have a different interpretation of that passage? Kind of, yeah. So, but as far as the women, I mean, I could go on and on and on, Caryn, but let me just suffice it to say, for the interest of time, that I think my chapter 3 is going to be called something like "Look at How Much We Can Do and Women's Role in the Church." And it might seem like from this conversation today a time warp of what is it when in that context really ascribing to the complementarian roles and very called to what they can do. I don't know if that's helpful. It's a lot of questions there, and I'm looking at, but one thing I am interested in is studying women who are, and not flattening them for having a different viewpoint, but trying to seek to understand and paint them in the well-rounded people that they are and how they come to the viewpoints that they come to.
Wow, thanks, Marie. We'll try this randomly, and any of the panelists have any final thoughts that they would like to share? Oh, okay, I see Ruth waving at me.
Pastor Lynn touched on this too, but I think there are absolute benefits of being a woman in ministry, that I have been able to enter some situations that my male colleagues wouldn't necessarily have the same experience. When I was a new pastor, I was visiting a woman that I see her often in her care center, and we would have communion. And then I'd always say, is there anything else I can do for you? And this was a little routine we got into. And she'd say, don't tell my colleague, who was male, but would you help me hang up my laundry? The aides don't do it correctly. And we had the most intimate, beautiful conversations because I was hanging up her nightgowns and folding her underwear the way she wanted it to be done. And those moments like never would have happened to a male colleague, and she was always, you know, it just became a routine, like, you hang up my nightgown so nicely. But so just those moments of entering into that kind of familiar space with really, especially with women too, but I think that that's a more common experience for women in ministry than their male colleagues. And I want to give a shout out to Peter, because before I was at Prince of Peace, I signed up for a book group through the Synod, and it was She, the Carolyn Lewis book. And it was a fabulous group of pastors. And there was one guy who joined that group to read She, and it was Peter. And he said, I figured I should read this book because I work with women in ministry. Like, mind blown, right? Most, I don't think that many men in the Synod would have said, I should read this book and join this conversation, because obviously I work with women. So just, Peter, you can't respond. This is our time. But I just wanted to give you a shout out.
Excellent. Great. Cindy.
That was a great lead into what I was thinking, Ruth, because I think one of the things that women bring to the table is the fact that, or at least this is what I'm hoping for, is that we aren't going to communicate dualistically anymore. We aren't going to demonize what was. We aren't going to, we're not going to say us and them. We're going to work towards we. And I think that that's a communication style that we've grown into because we are women. We're always looking for that common ground. And I think that men are too. And I just, I'm so tuned into how dualistically we all think. And it's one of my goals is that to not, to not get into that us and them, you know, the in and out, all of that kind of language. And I think that as we women that have strong personalities come forward without shame and without, you know, we will come forward that way powerfully, but with the anticipation that we're all going to do this together. And we aren't going to, you know, if you grew up one way and something is hard, let's talk about that. Let's come together under the umbrella, which is where most of I have a lot of young people who aren't in the church, and I know that they're in the yoga studio, which is what gives me a lot of courage to keep doing what I'm doing. But we can come together under the big umbrella of there is something greater than self, and let's talk about what that looks like and learn from each other. And so I really, I started this idea to not be dualistic probably a few years ago, and I'm still working on it, but because it is a way of thinking. But I think as we come forward together, that idea that we can do this together is really a foundation that will help the church be in the world in the future. So, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Pastor Anita.
I want to just re-echo a couple of the themes. One is the gratitude that I have for the women who came before. The second is the power of language. And I appreciated what Ruth said about having your stock phrases, because we all have these stories about, well, somebody said something and I laughed or I didn't know what to say. And I have 3 daughters, and they have taught me about microaggressions and macroaggressions and not standing for this and not standing for that. And it's a practice that one has to learn. And so, Ruth, I appreciated that stock language part. And then the other thing about language is the church is steeped in patriarchal language. So it's one thing to have our bodies up front, which helps a lot, but the language is, and you guys at Prince of Peace, remember how hard I worked on that. So I just want to throw that out there and have us all be sensitive to the language that we use. And particularly what I'm talking about is, you know, God, he, and all the patriarchs, those wonderful Moses and all those guys. And I did watch the worship this morning, and Betsy had that long list of Lydia. Anyway, language is important, and we have to use it.
Thanks, Anita. I actually, when I've gone back home to some of my siblings that are the Missouri Synod churches, it always jars me when I hear the male language, and a lot of that is your introduction and affirming and being intentional about using multi-gendered language. Great, and Sonja.
Thanks, Anita. That was really vital and important to hear. And I see Paul Sponheim on this Zoom, and I'm thinking about the teaching theologians that have been so vibrant and creative and incredible in thinking about this theologically, that we were steeped in really good creative theology. I think about Terry Fretheim's memorial service and the profound work he did of the suffering God, and the openness to how God is portrayed and named, and the mark that Paul, you and Terry and others made on so many of us. And I think the importance of really good theology and the space in which to do that work together with freedom, not with boundaries, but with freedom, is so important. And to have places to do that with really good theologians. So thank you, Paul, and to others that continue that work. We are ever so grateful.
I agree. Thank you.
Great. Becca or Betsy, do either of you have anything you'd like to share?
I'll just jump in and say, I think everybody else is so articulate. I would love to just leave it at that. But I do believe the Holy Spirit is always at work. And I loved that in your worship today about how the Holy Spirit surprised Mary, continues to surprise us all. And to remember that that's bigger than our human experience too. When we think things are impossible, God's always bringing new possibilities.
Thanks, Becca.
I would just like to say it's been really fun to connect with each of these women who are ordained and connected in some way to Prince of Peace. So putting this worship service today together and then hearing everybody's comments has been really rewarding and refreshing. And to hear people's backgrounds and stories, I'm just really excited about it. To be in ministry, not just as a woman, but to be in ministry in general.
Great. Well, I'd like to, thank everybody for, this has been a wonderful discussion. Like I said, we could probably go for another 5 hours on this, but really I give thanks to God for all of you and the ministry that you share, and the connections have been wondering. So thank you so much for the ministry that you have, for your experiences in the ministry that you will have. The church is truly blessed by all of your calls. Thank you.
And thank you, Caryn.
Awesome. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks for including me.
Yes, thank you for hanging in there with us a little longer. Can I close us with a word of prayer? Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for your people gathered here who we know as Prince of Peace. Thank you for the gifts that you have shared with all of us, and for helping us to find ways during a pandemic to connect with one another, with our families, with our friends, and with the greater world. We know that the Holy Spirit is blowing through your world, even as we are dealing with isolation and pandemic and all kinds of social unrest and political changes and things going on in our country. Guide us as we move forward in our day, our week, and our year. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
It's a wonderful forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Betsy,
Paul,
has it been recorded?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Great,
Yeah, so this will be available on our website also.
great.
Mhm. And Paul, did you notice I mentioned, or I listed your name on the slides about having preached at, was it Sonja's ordination?
I saw that, yes. This is really inspirational, such a terrific ministry from these marvelous women. Prince of Peace has been so fortunate.
And I want to echo what Sonja said too, that Paul Sponheim and Terry Fredheim were very key. I mean, women knew that who to go to and what classes to take, and or even just stumble into a Paul Sponheim class and have your mind blown and taught the difference between how what sin looks, a possible variation, what sin looks like from a male perspective and what sin looks like from a female perspective. I still remember that. The difference between pride and self-denigration. Paul, remember teaching on that?
Oh, sure. Maybe you were responsible. My students gave me a stamp, you know. So I because I had complained about writing the same sentence on all these papers, it was in the analysis of sin. And of course, people had gone to school with Reinhold Niebuhr, and the emphasis on pride being the essence of sin. So I was writing on papers, self-denigration is also a sin. It does look different.
Yeah.
And if you have a woman who is culturally encouraged to think less well of herself, and then you preach against pride, you get a double whammy there, you know. There's so much that needs to be taken apart and be examined. We are doing better. I remember the first women: Barbara Andrews, Dawn Prue, Suzanne Bach. I remember the first women, and then there got to be 5, and then there are 7, and you no longer could point them out in chapel because there were so many. Why did it take so long? We were so slow, but I'm so grateful for these 50 years and for you people in particular, how much you have helped me and helped me to understand.
Thank you. Thank you, Caryn, for your leadership.
Yeah.
You're welcome. This was an honor.
Good.
Thanks, Caryn, very much.
Thank you.
So long.
Wow. You want to go over?
Mhm.